Karen was on vacation in a beautiful historic city known for its grand castle and rich royal traditions. The city was bustling with tourists, eager to take in the sights, including the famous royal guards stationed at the castle. These guards were known for their stoic expressions and their ability to stand perfectly still for hours at a time, performing their ceremonial duties with precision. For many visitors, the sight of these guards was a highlight, representing a deep connection to the country's history. But for Karen, it wasn't just about admiring the culture and history of the city. She had a reputation for being outspoken, often expecting others to cater to her every need. This particular day, as Karen strolled through the busy streets, she grew increasingly irritated. Everywhere she went, people were respectful and following the rules, but she didn't like the idea of being surrounded by tradition that she didn't understand. As she came upon the royal guards, she noticed how they stood still, almost like statues, their eyes forward, their bodies rigid. To Karen, it seemed almost absurd. How could anyone stand so still for such long periods? Why were they acting like they were above the rest of the people, just standing there without engaging anyone? Karen felt like she had to make her thoughts known. After all, it didn't seem right to her that these guards, part of a royal tradition, weren't acknowledging the tourists around them. People were taking pictures and trying to interact with them, but the guards didn't even flinch. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. "They should be more friendly. People are just trying to enjoy their day." As she watched the guards for a moment longer, Karen's frustration grew. She couldn't understand why they were so rigid. It wasn't like they were doing anything important, or at least that's how she saw it. They weren't smiling, they weren't waving to the crowd. They were just standing there, as if their only job was to be part of some outdated tradition. Karen wasn't used to being ignored, especially in such a public place. She had always been someone who expected attention and acknowledgement from others. If she was in a group, she often found herself the center of conversation, and she had little tolerance for being overlooked. So, as the guards stood motionless, she decided to take action. She walked up to one of the guards, a tall man with a stern face and an immaculate uniform. He didn't even blink. Karen's impatience grew, and she placed her hands on her hips, ready to speak up. "Hey, you could at least smile or say hello, you know," she said in a loud, condescending tone. The crowd around her began to notice, but many of them stayed quiet, unsure whether to get involved. Karen felt a sense of satisfaction, thinking that she was about to get the royal guard to break character and acknowledge her. She crossed her arms and waited for a reaction. The attention she craved seemed to be just a few words away. But the guard, as if completely unfazed by her words, continued standing perfectly still. Karen frowned. This only fueled her irritation, as she couldn't understand why he wasn't giving in to her demands for attention. After all, she was just being friendly, or so she thought. And this moment, standing before the stoic figure, was only the beginning of what would become a much bigger interaction. Karen stood there, feeling a mix of confusion and frustration. The guard in front of her showed no signs of moving, speaking, or acknowledging her in any way. It was almost as though she wasn't even there. The longer the guard stayed completely still, the more Karen's annoyance grew. She had expected some kind of reaction, at least a simple nod or a smile. But there was nothing. It was as if the guard was completely immune to her words, as though he had been trained to ignore everything around him. The crowd that had gathered around them was beginning to notice the tension. Some people were starting to glance over, wondering what was going to happen next. A few tourists nearby were already snapping pictures of the royal guards, but Karen was no longer paying attention to them. Her focus was entirely on the unmoving figure before her. "Are you seriously not going to say anything?" Karen said, raising her voice just enough to draw more attention. She was hoping this time the guard would at least look her way or offer a word of reassurance. But still, there was no movement, not even a flicker of the eyes. The guard's face remained expressionless, his eyes locked ahead, unwavering. By now, Karen's frustration had turned into disbelief. She couldn't believe that someone would just ignore her like this, especially in such a public setting. She had always been able to get people's attention when she wanted to, and the guard's lack of reaction was both surprising and infuriating. She stood there for a moment, thinking of what to say next, determined to get him to react. "Come on, this is ridiculous. Why do you have to act like a statue? You're not doing anything important anyway," Karen said, her voice becoming sharper. She was growing impatient, and her words were becoming more direct, laced with sarcasm. She glanced around at the people in the crowd, hoping that someone might agree with her. Some people were whispering to each other, unsure of how to respond. A few looked at Karen with an expression of mild discomfort, but no one spoke up. Karen's mind was racing now. She had seen tourists interacting with royal guards in the past, some even joking around, trying to make the guards smile or react. But no matter what they did, the guards always stayed calm, never giving in. Karen didn't know much about royal traditions, but she knew that something about this wasn't right in her eyes. With a defiant huff, Karen took a step closer to the guard, her voice now filled with challenge. "Is this what you do all day? Just stand there and ignore people? Maybe you should try acting human for once." She almost expected the guard to snap at her, to react in some way, but still, nothing happened. He didn't budge, didn't blink, and didn't even acknowledge her presence. As Karen stood there, her words hanging in the air, she began to notice how quiet the crowd had become. Some of the onlookers were looking at her, others at the guard, but there was a definite sense of tension in the air. For the first time, Karen felt a pang of doubt. She realized that while she had been raising her voice and making demands, the people around her weren't reacting the way she had expected. They weren't laughing or nodding in agreement. Instead, they were watching her, waiting for her next move. Karen had always prided herself on her ability to control a situation, but now she was starting to feel like she was losing control. And with the royal guard still standing motionless before her, it seemed as though she had underestimated the situation entirely. Karen stood there, her patience wearing thin. She couldn't understand why the royal guard was behaving like this. After all, what harm could there be in a simple conversation or a smile? It seemed like such a small thing, yet the guard remained as still as ever, his eyes fixed ahead. Karen's frustration only deepened as the seconds ticked by, and the crowd continued to watch in silence. She had expected some sort of reaction, a glance, a word, anything, but there was nothing. She glanced around at the people watching her, hoping for some sign of support. Some tourists were snapping photos, others were talking quietly amongst themselves, but no one seemed willing to speak up on her behalf. The quietness of the crowd was starting to make Karen feel uneasy. She was used to people responding to her, whether it was agreeing with her or at least acknowledging her presence. But here, no one was doing either. The more Karen thought about it, the more annoyed she became. She had tried to be patient, but this was going too far. Determined to break the silence, Karen took a deep breath and stepped forward, raising her voice once again. "I don't know why you have to be so rude," she said sharply. "It's not like I'm asking you to do anything impossible. I'm just trying to be friendly." She waved her hand in the air, as if to emphasize her point. The crowd seemed to tense up, and Karen noticed a few people exchanging uneasy glances. It wasn't just the guard who wasn't reacting. The audience, too, seemed oddly silent, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Karen's eyes narrowed as she tried to figure out what was going on. She had encountered people in similar situations before, people who didn't respond to her demands or requests. Usually, a little persistence would get them to open up, but this time, it wasn't working. She couldn't figure out what the royal guard's problem was. "You're supposed to be a public servant, right? You should be a little more polite," Karen continued, her voice now rising in volume. She had crossed a line into confrontation, and she wasn't about to back down now. Still, the guard did not flinch. His face remained as calm and expressionless as ever. Karen felt her anger bubbling up. She couldn't believe he was making her look like a fool in front of all these people. "What's wrong with you? You've been standing there for who knows how long, and you won't even talk to anyone. How hard can it be to show some respect?" She snapped, her voice laced with frustration. At this point, some of the onlookers were starting to look uncomfortable, and a few even stepped away from the scene. They didn't want to get involved, and who could blame them? Karen's tone had become more aggressive, and the more she spoke, the more out of place she felt. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right with her. The Royal Guard's stillness was unsettling, and the silence of the crowd made everything feel awkward. Yet, no one was saying anything. Karen took another step forward, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could make the guard react. She was determined to force him to acknowledge her. But instead of breaking his composure, the guard stood his ground. His stillness was like an immovable wall, and Karen, for the first time, realized that her usual tactics weren't working. Her words hung in the air, but they seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the unyielding silence. For a brief moment, Karen's anger gave way to confusion. She had expected to see some kind of reaction, either the guard getting annoyed, or maybe even a remark about her behavior. But instead, all she could see was the Royal Guard's perfect posture, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he was in another world altogether. And the more Karen tried to get his attention, the more the crowd seemed to turn their focus on her, as if waiting for her to stop. This quiet, intense standoff was not what Karen had anticipated. She had expected to feel the rush of victory once the guard responded, but now, the reality was sinking in. She had made herself the center of attention, but not in the way she had hoped. The crowd was watching her, not the guard, and Karen began to realize that this wasn't just about her trying to make a point. It was about something far bigger than her. The tension in the air was thick, and Karen knew that if she didn't stop, she might lose the respect of everyone around her. Karen could feel her frustration mounting. But now, something was starting to shift inside her. She had expected the guard to crumble under her words, or, at the very least, give some kind of acknowledgement. But instead, the more she spoke, the more the guard seemed to stand his ground, silent and still as ever. It was almost as though he didn't care at all about what she was saying. The more she tried to provoke a reaction, the more she realized that it wasn't going to work. She had always been able to control a situation with words, but now, this Royal Guard was showing her that some people couldn't be moved by anger or frustration. Around her, the crowd had grown noticeably quiet. The tourists who had been watching her now seemed unsure of how to react. Some were still holding up their phones to snap photos, but the playful energy of the moment was beginning to fade. Karen's tone had turned harsh, and she had crossed a line by openly criticizing the guard. The looks from the bystanders were changing. Some were even frowning, giving her disapproving glances, as if they had started to lose respect for her. This wasn't how she had imagined things going. She had thought the guard would break his composure and perhaps offer some sort of explanation, or maybe even apologize for his silence. Instead, she was left standing there, feeling increasingly isolated. As Karen took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, she noticed the crowd's eyes on her. It was like they were waiting for her to back down, to stop her tirade. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. She pressed on, speaking more loudly than before. "I can't believe this. What kind of job is this? You're supposed to represent the royal family, but you can't even acknowledge the people who admire you. You just stand there like you don't care about anyone," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. She couldn't help herself. She felt humiliated, and now she wanted the guard to feel some of that same embarrassment. The guard, however, remained as still as ever. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break character. Karen's words, as loud and pointed as they were, seemed to have no effect. She was beginning to feel like she was talking to a brick wall. And the longer the guard stood there without responding, the more Karen realized that perhaps this wasn't just about her. Maybe, just maybe, The guard was teaching her a lesson she wasn't ready to learn. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd's discomfort began to grow. It was clear that Karen's outburst was becoming the focal point of attention, and people were beginning to feel uneasy. Some shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, others whispered quietly to each other, but none of them were coming to Karen's defense. In fact, the more she raised her voice, the more distant the crowd seemed to become. Karen, for the first time, felt vulnerable in this public moment. She was no longer the confident, controlling woman who could make anyone listen. Instead, she felt small and out of place, her words falling flat in front of a silent and composed guard. There was no satisfaction in making the guard respond to her. In fact, it almost seemed like he was winning, not by speaking, but by simply standing there with calm resolve. The moment stretched on, and Karen's internal dialogue began to shift. What was she really trying to accomplish here? Was it worth alienating everyone around her? Was this really how she wanted to be remembered? The guard's unwavering composure had forced her to stop and question her own actions. In her effort to get a reaction, she had lost sight of the situation and had ended up making herself the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. As she stood there, her thoughts racing, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The crowd was no longer watching the guard, but watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. And for the first time, Karen realized that sometimes silence could speak louder than words. Karen stood there, feeling the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. Her words had fallen silent, and the air around her had shifted. The crowd, once intrigued by her outburst, now seemed to be waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Karen's eyes flicked nervously across the faces of the onlookers. They were no longer amused by her antics. Instead, their expressions had turned uncomfortable, some even looking away. She felt a strange pressure building, almost as if the entire scene was being judged, and she wasn't sure whether she was winning or losing. The royal guard, however, remained unmovable, like a statue. His posture was perfect, his eyes fixed ahead, his face unreadable. The more Karen thought about it, the more impressed she became by his discipline. How could he remain so calm in the face of her relentless taunting? It was like he wasn't even affected by her words. For the first time, Karen realized that the guard wasn't just standing still because of tradition. He was demonstrating something far greater: control, patience, and dignity. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. Her anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but now there was a small flicker of something else. Was it embarrassment? Regret? She had been so focused on trying to get the guard to react, to make him bend to her will, that she hadn't considered the possibility that maybe she was the one in the wrong. But how could that be? She was simply trying to engage with him, right? Yet, as she looked around at the crowd and felt the growing discomfort, it dawned on her that perhaps her approach wasn't as friendly as she thought. Then something unexpected happened. The guard, still standing tall and unmoving, spoke, breaking the silence that had settled around them. His voice was calm, steady, and measured, the kind of voice that commanded respect without raising it above a quiet tone. "I understand that you are frustrated," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a gentle breeze. "But please, understand that this is not about ignoring people." Karen blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to speak at all, let alone offer an explanation. She had anticipated a sharp retort, perhaps a defensive response, but this wasn't what she had imagined. He continued, his tone never wavering, his eyes still focused ahead. "I am here to do my duty, not to engage in conversations or entertain requests. My role is to be present, to uphold the tradition and discipline of the Royal Guard. That is the respect I offer." Karen was taken aback. The crowd, too, seemed to be in shock at his calm response. For a moment, the world around her seemed to pause, and all she could hear was the soft echo of the guard's words. The way he spoke wasn't condescending or angry. It was simple, humble, and wise in a way that Karen wasn't used to. She had expected a confrontation, an argument that would validate her feelings, but instead, she was faced with a quiet understanding of duty and responsibility that she couldn't quite grasp. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could she say? How could she argue with someone who had just shown her an entirely different perspective? The guard hadn't raised his voice or tried to put her down. Instead, he had given her a lesson in patience and restraint, qualities Karen rarely valued in her daily life. It was as if he had just shifted her view, even if she didn't want it to be shifted. Karen's mind raced. She had spent the entire time trying to make the guard react, trying to force him into a moment of weakness. But in doing so, she had failed to see that the guard's strength lay not in responding to her, but in remaining unaffected by her provocations. And now, as the silence lingered, she realized that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about learning something that she hadn't expected to learn: humility. The crowd, too, seemed to feel the shift. The uncomfortable tension in the air began to dissipate as people took in the moment. Karen's outburst, which had once seemed so powerful, now seemed small in comparison to the quiet dignity of the Royal Guard. For the first time, Karen felt the weight of her own actions and understood that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. As the guard returned to his original position, still standing tall and composed, Karen stood silently for a moment longer, reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. Karen stood still for a moment, her mind racing. The guard's words lingered in the air, and she found herself trying to process what had just happened. She had expected to be in control of the situation, to get the Royal Guard to break his composure and respond to her in some way. But instead, it had been the opposite. The guard had remained calm and composed throughout, and in doing so, had taught her a lesson that she wasn't prepared for. It wasn't about getting a reaction from him. It was about understanding his dedication to his role and the respect that came with it. As Karen stood there, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt embarrassed by how she had acted. She had been so focused on trying to make the guard react that she hadn't considered the deeper meaning behind his actions. On the other hand, there was a part of her that felt a strange sense of respect for him. His ability to stand firm, without flinching or engaging in the drama she had created, was something Karen wasn't used to. It was the kind of self-discipline that she hadn't encountered much in her own life. Looking around at the crowd, Karen noticed that people were starting to move again, some of them shaking their heads, while others were quietly discussing what had just happened. The atmosphere was no longer tense, but it had changed in a subtle way. The tourists who had once been entertained by the standoff now seemed to be reflecting on the situation, perhaps even questioning the way they had reacted. Karen was aware that she had become the center of attention, but not in the way she had hoped. The moment had shifted, and she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Her heart was still racing, and she couldn't help but feel the sting of pride that had been hurt. It wasn't just about the guard anymore. It was about her own behavior and how she had allowed her frustration to control the situation. She had assumed that everyone should conform to her expectations, that people should respond the way she wanted them to. But the Royal Guard had shown her that sometimes silence was the strongest response, and not every situation needed a reaction. As she stood there, looking at the guard, she realized how much she could learn from him. His dedication to his duty was something she hadn't understood before. The idea of standing firm, unwavering in the face of distractions, was foreign to her. In her world, everything was fast-paced, and everyone had to have an opinion or a reaction to everything. But the guard had shown her that sometimes the greatest strength lay in remaining silent, staying true to your purpose, and not letting the noise of the world pull you off course. Karen's gaze softened as she continued to watch the guard. His posture was still perfect, his eyes unwavering, as if the world around him had no power over him. She had expected him to crumble, to get frustrated or angry, but he had done the opposite. He had remained calm and composed, which, in a way, had made her feel like she was the one out of place. The longer she stood there, the more she realized how much she had underestimated him. For a moment, Karen felt a sense of admiration for the guard. He wasn't just a figure standing in front of her. He was someone who represented something much larger: discipline, duty, and respect for tradition. And in that moment, Karen understood that these qualities were things she could use in her own life. She could see how they could help her navigate situations with more grace and humility. Karen took a step back, her posture changing slightly. The anger and frustration that had consumed her earlier were gone now, replaced by a quiet reflection. She didn't know if the guard could sense the change in her, but she hoped that, in some small way, he could. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt a bit of humility. It wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about understanding the value of composure, dignity, and respect. As the moment stretched on, Karen knew that this encounter had left an impression on her, one that would stay with her long after she left the castle. It wasn't just about the royal guard or the crowd around her. It was about herself, and the realization that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain calm, composed, and true to who you are. As Karen stood there in the midst of the crowd, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way her frustration and impatience had slowly turned into something much deeper, a sense of understanding. Her earlier outburst, filled with anger and demand, had felt so powerful in the moment. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she couldn't help but feel a touch of embarrassment. She had let her emotions dictate her actions, thinking that if she pushed hard enough, she could get the guard to react in a way that suited her. But the royal guard had shown her that sometimes silence could be the most powerful response. The crowd around her had started to dissipate, some people moving on with their day, others talking in low voices, reflecting on the strange encounter they had just witnessed. Karen wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, lost in her thoughts, but it felt like time had slowed down. The moment had been a lesson, one that she had never expected to learn in such a public way. She glanced at the guard once more, his figure still standing tall and unwavering, a symbol of quiet strength. He had not shown any sign of frustration or irritation, and it was clear that he was unaffected by her earlier remarks. His calmness was almost hypnotic, and Karen felt a strange sense of respect for him, even though she had never asked for it. For the first time, Karen realized that her desire for validation had driven her actions. She had sought approval through confrontation, assuming that if she could get the royal guard to acknowledge her in any way, it would somehow validate her presence. But the guard's indifference had shattered that illusion. He had no need for approval or validation, and his quiet composure was all the affirmation he needed. In that moment, Karen felt small in comparison. She had let her ego guide her actions, and the outcome had shown her the futility of that approach. The realization hit her hard, and for a brief moment, she felt a pang of regret. Why had she allowed herself to behave that way? Why had she let her frustration with the guard, and the situation as a whole, control her? She had always prided herself on being able to navigate any situation, to talk her way through challenges and win people over with her charm. But now, she saw that some situations required a different approach, one rooted in patience, respect, and understanding. As the last of the crowd filtered away, Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't proud of how she had acted, but she also knew that there was an important lesson to be learned from this experience. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about proving a point or forcing someone to respond. It was about understanding that not every situation needed a response, and not every person was going to react the way you wanted them to. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was simply stand your ground, like the royal guard had done, and remain composed. Karen looked at the guard once more, and this time, her gaze softened. She didn't expect him to acknowledge her, nor did she need him to. The lesson had been learned in her own heart, and that was enough. She had learned the value of patience, humility, and self-control, qualities that she hadn't paid much attention to before, but that she now realized were essential for navigating life with grace. As she began to walk away, her steps were slower, more deliberate. There was no need to rush now. She had learned something valuable, something that would stay with her long after this encounter was over. She didn't need the approval of others to feel validated. What mattered was how she carried herself and how she treated others. The royal guard had shown her that sometimes actions spoke louder than words, and in his quiet strength, he had taught her more than any confrontation ever could. With a newfound sense of calm, Karen left the scene, her mind no longer racing with frustration or anger. She was at peace with the lesson she had learned, and though it hadn't been easy, she knew it was one she would carry with her in the days to come. The royal guard, with his silent discipline, had given her the gift of self-reflection. And for that, she was grateful. As Karen walked away from the scene, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. The experience with the royal guard had left a lasting impression, and though she didn't fully understand it at the time, she could feel its impact. It wasn't just about the guard's silence or the crowd's reaction. It was about how the entire situation had forced her to reflect on herself and her own behavior. The more she thought about it, the more Karen realized that her outburst had been fueled by her need for control. She had wanted to dictate how the moment would unfold, thinking that by making the guard respond to her, she could somehow prove something. But the more she reflected, the more she understood that real strength didn't come from forcing a reaction. It came from the ability to remain calm, composed, and unaffected by the distractions around you. And that was something the guard had shown her in the most unexpected way. Karen had always considered herself a strong-willed person, someone who could stand her ground and make things happen. But this experience had revealed a different kind of strength, one rooted in patience, humility, and self-awareness. She began to realize that she had been so focused on proving herself that she hadn't stopped to consider the value of simply observing and listening. The royal guard had mastered the art of being present without needing to be heard, and in doing so, he had shown her the power of silence. As she continued walking, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson she had learned, even if it had come in an uncomfortable package. She knew that in the future, she would approach situations with more patience, more understanding. She didn't have to control everything. There were times when stepping back, being silent, and allowing things to unfold naturally was the best way to handle a situation. The guard's unwavering composure had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response is to remain still and confident, without the need for words or actions. The further she walked, the more the lesson settled into her mind. She wasn't the same person who had stood in front of the guard, frustrated and angry. Something had shifted within her, and she was starting to feel more at peace with herself. The world wasn't always going to bend to her will, and that was okay. Sometimes the best thing she could do was simply accept things as they were and trust that the right path would reveal itself in time. By the time she had reached the end of the street, Karen's perspective had transformed. She felt lighter, almost like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She no longer felt the need to prove herself in every situation. She understood now that her true strength came from within, from the way she carried herself and the way she treated others. And that was far more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. As she looked back one last time at the spot where the royal guard had stood, she felt a sense of respect that she hadn't felt before. It wasn't admiration in the way she had imagined it. There was no need for applause or recognition. It was simply the quiet understanding that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected places. And in that brief encounter, Karen had learned something she would never forget. With a deep breath, Karen smiled to herself, realizing that her encounter with the royal guard had changed her for the better. She was no longer the woman who needed to dominate every conversation or challenge every authority. She was learning to embrace the stillness, the silence, and the peace that came with letting go of the need to control everything. And that, she realized, was true strength. Karen walked on, with a new sense of purpose and calm. She was ready for whatever came next, not because she could force her way through it, but because she now knew how to face it with grace and self-assurance. The lesson from the Royal Guard had taught her more than she had ever expected, and she was grateful for it, knowing it would shape the way she approached life from that moment on.